Bonjour, bonjour à tous. Merci de nous rejoindre pour.
Welcome everyone. Thank you for being with us for this roundtable. We're going to question the means and production means for innovation at the territorial scale. Laurent is going to be our moderator, well, along with me. So we have around the table a group of researchers that work on research financed by the National Agency for Research or other programs, and that are looking through their own discipline, of course, their own field. This question, which is becoming more and more relevant because we're faced with a crisis that really hit cities pretty hard. So we're going to exchange on this topic. Maybe just to add on what's been said and leave the floor briefly through a roundtable that we have come up with. Let me introduce you. Dominique Sagot-Duvauroux teaches economics at the University of Angers. He's going to tell us about the challenges for the research programs at stake today. Mr. Richard, who's in charge of the, Jean-Luc Charles, sorry, General Director of the Samoa, and who's going to be speaking in the second part of our roundtable. Emmanuel Gangloff, researcher, along with Hélène Morteau. As researchers, they will be talking about about the state of the art and the questions raised by this topic. And Charles Ambrosino teaches at University in Grenoble and leads a research program and will bring into perspective Nantes, Madrid, and Grenoble, because we don't want to focus exclusively on Nantes. Julie Laernoes, you had to extradite yourself from the Municipal Council meeting. You are following up the works of researchers. You're Vice President of the Municipal Council of Nantes. You have many titles. You're in charge of climate, energy transition, food transition, agriculture, resilience, and economic mutations. So we'll question the notion of resilience in these very specific and unprecedented times. And myself, I am a teacher at the School for Architecture in Nantes, and we're going to ask questions. We have two other speakers that are not on site. They're not far. They're at a visio conference. François Ménard, who's a sociologist in urban development, and you will probably see him on your screen right now. Hello, François. And later on, we'll have Montserrat Pareja-Eastaway, sorry for the way I pronounce her name, teacher in the Autonomous University of Barcelona, who will be with us within an hour. So let's hear about two research programs that Dominique can tell us about. Thank you, Laurent. When we started thinking on making this event around Nantes, European Capital of Innovation, we thought it would be interesting to associate two research programs looking into topics of urban innovation and what does the crisis mean in the evolution of urban innovation systems. We have two programs that are cross-cutting and different at the same time. The first one is SCAENA. It brings together the University of Nantes, the University of Angers, of Grenoble, of Paris 3, the Architecture School of Nantes and Grenoble, and the point of this research program is to look at the complex interconnections between located artistic activities and urban dynamics in general. How do artistic activities, the presence of creative entrepreneurship and startup companies, and the space entity of a city? So we're trying to bring together architects, urban specialists, economists, geography specialists, sociologists, philosophers. We're trying to have a systemic and cross-cutting approach of urban dynamics, focusing on the various types of artistic creations with the underlying hypothesis that these artistic activities have specific impacts on their territories. It's not the same to have a bank or a bookshop on a city place. It has different impacts. So these are the things we're looking at. Among the hypotheses we're testing is that a stage-like territory, when planets are aligned, if you will, between the invisible creativity of a territory, what the underground scene of a territory, as they say in Montreal, the creativity of individual stakeholders, and the creativity of institutions or organizations that in Montreal they call the upper ground. How do they work together? How do they cross path? What are the events, the values exchanged or differing? At some point, an innovative territory, a nice to live in territory like Nantes, Grenoble, Angers, Arles also that we're working on, are interesting examples in that matter, because there are such places. And this research program that is co-piloted, co-steered, if you will, by Charlotte Rosino and myself, is cross-cutting with another program called DEMEXTRA, which looks more into the systems for innovation. And the idea is that there are different systems for innovation, or innovation regimen, if you will. One based on exploration, one based on transformation, and the third one, you will hear more about it in the different cities examples. And what we're trying to reprocess, we're trying to rethink our approach, refocusing it on the artistic aspect of territories, once again. So this is the cross-cutting part of these two programs. Thank you. So maybe the English title of this roundtable, Post-COVID Cities. Well, firstly, are we yet in the post-COVID era? And more broadly speaking, in the next world to come, in the world of tomorrow, will it differ from the world before the crisis? That's why I say it into inverted commas. So there will be two moments in this roundtable. We're going to present a few topics in the research field. The two programs that you presented, it can have different meanings in a given territory and between territories. And when we say urban innovation and the world of yesterday, what does it mean? Maybe we'll speak about it during the debate. Maybe there is a sort of injunction to accelerate. This is something that we've heard. Maybe in the past we talked more about reactiveness, responsiveness and agility, and the concept of innovate or perish. That may leave on the side of the road some other interesting concepts. And yesterday we had a round table where we were on stage and we were talking about different kinds of innovation. So to go deeper into the difference between the pre-COVID and the post-COVID eras, let's start with listening to Charles Ambrosino from Grenoble to give us more tools to analyze these questions. You have the floor. I'm going to try and present you with some elements, food for thought, coming from research programs. I'm talking on behalf of a whole team with researchers in Grenoble, Nantes, and some of these two universities researchers, but working from Madrid. So this research is funded by the Architecture and Urban Planning entity and the National Environmental Agency in France, the ADEME, that François Ménard is going to tell you more about. Our research program asks the following question: how are urban innovations governed? How do stakeholders get coordinated within urban policies, urban municipal policies? And to answer this first question, another simple question, and you will see that in real life there may be more complex. Can we characterize ways of innovation depending on the territory? Is innovation made the same way in Grenoble, in Nantes, in Madrid, in Barcelona, in Stockholm? Is it the same or not? And the first element is that territories are not equal faced with innovations. Not all territories have the same capacity to support innovation in the long term. Whether they come from the territory, industrial districts, clusters, creative districts, and so on, and also territories that are able to innovate themselves and to be fostering themselves innovations. From one territory to the next, innovation is not carried out the same way. And that's my first point. My third point, there are cultural innovation aspects. The way people define innovation, the way they coordinate innovation, and the way they produce innovation. These three preconceived hypotheses enabled us to make samples, non-exhaustive samples of territories that were typical ideals of an innovative territory for the late 20th, early 21st centuries. Two things on our context. We questioned urban innovation, mainly. So innovations that are led in urban public policies, with or without the private sector. So there are two interesting movements to look at and to focus, to point out first, with our first results. Looking at urban policies, we see that since the 60s and up to today, we started with triggering and then experimenting innovative projects. Urban documents, the certainty that economic development could be triggered or promoted by urban changes mean that planification became key. The crisis of industries in the 80s, accelerated by decentralizations, devolutions of states, meant that urban projects, more than urban planning, became more and more intertwined and key, more agile. Planning is more long-term, whereas projects are more short-term. We all speak about experimentation, but experimenting and innovating are two different things in our group of research perspective. Second aspect I wanted to highlight is that late 20th, early 21st centuries, in urban development, we left aside the typical models of spatial organization of modern cities, the garden cities, the great urban models of the 20th, and we started talking about creative city, sustainable city, smart city, resilient city. I think it's the same notion that became more and more sophisticated. We talk about transition cities, or cities in transition, and it's less about the society of space and more about the way to consider experimentation and innovation. Why am I saying that? When talking about experimentations and the dissemination of these models, there's one interesting fact. All these models are telling the same story. How can we, in some territories, spot some environments that enable the prototyping of innovations to give them life in innovative urban policies? What is the creative city? It tells us an interesting story. The creative world, with artists people or creative people, artists or creative people, they would have the capacity to breach hierarchies and to bring to the fore innovations that would lead to transformation and regeneration, like Nantes went through. The notion of smart city and resilient city maybe is a different question. Maybe it's more related to engineering. The engineer is the one who can optimize urban networks. So who can we ask about how to experiment systems and prototypes that will make these solutions possible for simple stakes to formulate but difficult ones to tackle, like energy transition and so on? Transition cities are different. It's not only sustainable. It's not only about sophistication of technologies. It's about paradigm shift. Not through technology, but in the capacity of local societies to face the world to come in 30 or 40 years without fossil fuel, without petrol, without oil. So today, we need to take a step back. Experimenting is not the miracle solution that we used to think. Especially, collective action makes it possible to innovate. It's the key element. In that regard, experimenting is different from innovating. Experimenting, like what we call a niche, for instance, it's time for DIY, prototype testing, within a set of limitations that are full of uncertainties, like the COVID crisis, for instance. It forces us to think very short term for systems producing emergency services in the city or producing objects, masks, respirators, breathing machines, and so on. So some territories were capable to react faster than others. They were better coordinated to solve a given problem. However, innovation and an innovation system at a political level is that the capacity of being coordinated between different stakeholders from the tech and science world, from the political world and the civil society, but they get coordinated in the longer term, and that's what territorial economy tells us. Innovation is endogenous and becomes institutionalized in regimes that we call urban innovation regimes. You may ask me, how can we observe these different regimes of urban innovation? In the literature, we looked at, redefined what is experimenting. There are several ways of experimenting. We focused on three. First of all, you demonstrate something, like an engineer that uses a city at a scale, at a one scale, as a bench, test bench. Another way to experiment is more artistic and creative. It's called exploratory experimentation. So you test something, but you don't really know to what aim. Jean-Marc Ayrault and Jean Blaise tried to use artistic events to give meaning back to an industrial dying space because that is dying because of the crisis. And the third means of experimentation is transformative experimentation. It's not looking at a validation of a protocol or prototype to test a solution or something, but it's trying to change the entire environment in which the experimentation is taking place. For instance, after the 2008 crisis in Spain, civil labs were a result of the aggregation of urban development specialists, architects, citizens, collectives, inhabitants that reconquered public spaces and to redefine its connection with close services and urban local policies to counteract the neoliberal tendency in Madrid early 20th century and throughout the 20th century. So we have 3 experimentation regimes and 3 territories to explore this question. Through your research, did you spot one dominating predominant regime? These are ideal and typical regimes, and in each territory there are tensions. Some regimes are dominant and some are emerging and some are minor. What's interesting is that it seems that in every city we've explored and that we wish to explore, we realize that what's interesting is the formal definition of an element and the tensions existing. And so there can be a complementarity between a dominating regime and a more emerging regime. In Grenoble, the territory has the engineering as a strong basis, and in public policies they are used to conducting urban innovation using territories as test benches. The Caserne Bonne in the 90s. And so the city becomes like a window of technological solutions that are directly connected to the market. In the meantime, a secondary regime is having tensions with that vision of innovation. It's a more transformative regime which is shifting from sustainable city to transitioning city. Because stakeholders are capable of changing the environment of the city. But how does civil society get organized? And while experimentations are being repeated, how do we capitalize on the know-how that comes out of it in order to know how to lead the new public policies? So these 2 regimes are having tensions. In Nantes, we feel that there is the same. It's a more tension between the explorative regime in the 18th, especially in the 90s. It's become enshrined in the Nantes society, but there's a strong connection between urban policies and the artistic and creative worlds. Especially the Isle of Nantes is an extreme example of that. So we can ask how the digital revolution that many stakeholders are working from and with is actually a continuity of this explorative regime, and to see where it is taking us, or is it more about transformation? Is it a breakthrough, a new ways of working? Is it a change of cycle? We can identify who are the stakeholders and what are the objects we innovate from. I think we should keep this vision and this way of analyzing. And from this presentation, I would like now to give the floor to François Ménard from the PUCA Institutive Research Organization. And 3 years ago, they started a research call for project, Governing from and with Innovation. It's a research project that you are steering. And on the one hand, it has the hypothesis that there's a new regime for urban innovation. And on the other hand, we also started looking at the analysis on the sustainable city industrial demonstrators. And so it's a regime not only of demonstration, but also of industrial demonstration. So I now leave you the floor for a few minutes to move on.
Thank you, Laurent. Thank you for your invitation. Just to go back to our research institute, which conducts research in urban planning, we were actually looking at the question of innovation, and I don't want to spoil the end of my speech, but there is something which relates to ambiguity and a certain type of ambivalence. And I'm going to talk about Bertrand Vallée. The first observation was that we see some operations emerging a little bit everywhere. There were like all the projects that were emerging were all labeled as innovative projects. So the first question we raised was related to that. And there were other projects, like around smart city projects, where operators that claimed to be very disruptive were not appearing in the agenda of local councils. So I'm thinking here about the platform economy, for instance, BlaBlaCar, Uber, etc. And they were actually outside of the field that was defined by the collectivities and the local councils. So we need to think about the structure of this innovation. So let's think about this diktat of innovation. And there is at the same time this classifying work which kind of considers certain innovative approaches as having priority over other types of initiatives that wouldn't be labeled as innovative. So this relies on the hypothesis that innovation is brought by companies, private sector, private operators. Therefore, the set of rules of our country is not really adapted to it. So we need to disseminate the information, the innovation, and the role of the public sector is to disseminate these innovations through a certain number of rules and rights. So there was the idea that there were different types of regimes of innovation. What my colleague said, and there were other research teams. For example, the team led by Nadia Aral defined 5 different types of urban innovation. So it's just a way of talking about urban innovation in a different way. So just type of work on innovative fields. So this program, which is ongoing, we're still waiting for the results. But of course, there was something else we saw. Apart from that, we saw some calls for projects that were deemed to be innovative, calls for innovative projects, for example, reinventing cities, reinventing rural areas, etc. So projects that were not necessarily related to innovation directly, but which consisted in kind of removing the aspect about planning. Generally, the project holder was different from the user, the final user. So, and also ensuring the profitability of these projects. There was this jury procedure in the competitive exam, competitive initiative. So there were innovators that were ignored by the collectivities, the public collectivities, and there were like sustainable innovations that were just informing and shaping public discourse and policies. So I'd now like to come back to the notion of ambiguity and ambivalence. There is some ambiguity about the content of these innovations as a final product, as a new form of urban model, of urban space. So amongst the ones that we spotted, there were innovations related to technical and digital programs. So projects like smart grids, fab labs projects. Sometimes they also called upon more technical or more managerial innovations, regulations, which would conduct to a new urban model at the service of ecological transition and sustainable development. So now we want to say that innovation is not just about technology. Innovation has to do with society. There is also social innovation. And in the projects that are led and conducted by companies and other entities, we don't necessarily see that. And some blame the technological aspect of innovation, because the social aspect of innovation should be at the service of the collectivity. For example, Facebook is an operator and places human relationships at the heart of what it does, of its activity. Uber is also a type of social innovation. However, it is a social innovation that can be conducted at the expense of other activities, of other important aspects. And that seems quite obvious. And I'd like to go back to the health crisis, the sanitary crisis we're living in at the moment, with the kind of halt, the halt in the economy, the kind of the economy coming to a stop, to a standstill. And it is also a crisis that can also be like an alert, a warning, which actually needs to be a sign leading us to questioning our relationship with nature and maybe reassess innovations with something that participates in like a crisis of different regimes for futuristic projects. We've always had a very particular, very specific relationship with future, and utopia was always considered in a positive way. And if you look at these innovations and the crisis we're living in and we're experimenting today, it leaves us with a broad question and a broader questioning about our urban trajectories and the meaning of progress in general. If progress was the only innovation possible, then maybe we should place the idea of progress it should be at the service of something else. Or maybe progress doesn't rely entirely on innovations. And then what does progress mean? Can we actually imagine a progress without innovations? So the main stakeholders in charge of governance need to try to respond to these questions. These are questions we're confronted with today. And my colleague, Mr. Goff, speaks better about this than me, but we don't know if this constitutes only responses to the crisis we're living through, we're experimenting now, or is it really a way of rethinking our cities in order for us to live better? Thank you, François. And are there any? So these are important questions that you raise and useful questions. Do we need to kind of separate the notion of progress and the notion of innovations, and also the invitation you raise about the invitation to think about the future? I think it goes back to what Mr. Arto was saying, and it's a broader thought, a broader reflection we need to have. I have in mind 2 points. There are different types of local political cultures. They're not necessarily stable cultures. And there is also the idea of the public players, the public sector. You know, in the 1990s, sociologists were talking about the state as a moderator. And now the meaning of moderator is quite ambiguous, because it could go so far as to unlock some closed doors, and it could also accompany neoliberal policies. So, Julie, what do you think about these first discussions? It's always interesting to have a more scientific approach than the one we have in the city, because it's our role as elected representatives. How do we plan the city? How do we manage the city based on plans that can evolve? And the history of Nantes is linked to this story, the history of innovation. And there are also tensions that we feel are emerging, which were raised in the last election campaign, because we are kind of at the end of a cycle now. And there's been a lot of upheaval in the city. We got this innovation award in Nantes because we've got also the civil society is kind of bubbling. There's a lot of activity, and the notion of progress is questioned, of course. This is really at the core of the matrix of our ecological families. It also what is kind of caricatured by the subject of caricature by some people who are seeing ecological players as buffoons. But we need to be able to kind of question the very basis of our societies. And we've reached this moment whereby innovation for innovation's sake is not enough. And there needs to be a new debate, for example, with regards to 5G. And it is a debate that is cross-cutting in the whole society. We need to question the sense of the digital technologies, and we need to have a look at the real weight of the public structures and the relationship with private stakeholders. All this leads to major changes. Of course, we've lived through an unprecedented health crisis, which is leading us leading us to question all this and to think about all these issues. And this actually is the meaning of the delegation I was in charge of. I'm in charge of resilience and perspectives with regards to the shocks that are going to happen, the climate shocks, inundations, heat waves, but also how we can adapt to these changes, how we can try to live with a hotter climate. We were talking about the health crisis, but there are also we're going to have to experiment also to live with the increase of other diseases like the dengue. So there are different types of issues, health issues, climate issues, etc. And resilience needs to be thought both on the long term and on the middle term. We didn't really understand very well that concept. However, nowadays, we're trying to understand better what it means when we are experiencing shocks, whether it's an oil catastrophe or any type of shock. We need to see how to react facing these shocks. And cities are important in order to resist shocks. We're also social beings. We saw how lockdowns had such an impact on people. We saw also how solidarity proved to be so important. So many actions were taken during the lockdowns. During the lockdown, it wasn't an elected representative that gave instructions, but other public civil servants were acting to help alleviate some suffering. And for example, there were technical agents in charge of gardens that actually were very helpful, and they helped reconnect people and city dwellers with nature, and they did a lot with installing these orchards in Nantes to kind of produce food and vegetables that are accessible, that would be given for free to low-income households. So how do these actions that you mentioned that are brought by cities, how can they be put forward and transplanted and actually brought to new scales? I think you need the three components. I think this is an approach that comes from the Netherlands. There needs to be a trial, there needs to be a testing period. We learn from our mistakes. So experimenting is a way of transforming the city. we need to transform what works. I've just mentioned an example. It's important to see what works in the trials, in the tests, and we need to see what works, what doesn't really work, and we need to transform these tests as well. And so we need to assert and reaffirm a certain number of breaking points. When we look at the end of the lockdown, we had to sort out some, establish some policies. So we need to demonstrate and engage a certain number of breaking points, which are absolutely decisive, and there might be some challenges, some difficulties in doing so, and we need to expose these difficulties. Thank you. We still have about 10 minutes, and we'll go back on this more clearly later. I don't know. I'm looking at my colleagues. I don't know if you want to come back to what has been said. I just want to come back to what was said about procedural innovations. François Ménard talked about it, about the calls for projects that were claimed that they're labeled innovative, but that were not necessarily that innovative. And it is very different from what we could see 2 years ago when we had a kind of a test area, an experimental area, or a robot. Or is this a testimony about a breaking period? Have we actually left this previous model, or is this a tendency that will come back as fast as it can, as quickly as possible? Jean-Luc Charles, yes, I would like to go back to what Julie was saying. Well, actually, tomorrow's world is the world of solutions, actually. And we're not looking for a society based on solutions. I think it's important to ask ourselves questions. We're going to enter a new regime of transformations of our lifestyles, of our ways of life. So we need to think about another type of urban model that also considers the city as it is now, that works with what we have now. We have, it is also kind of difficult to engage transformation in cities that, the cities that we have now. And with globalization, we're kind of the victims of a loss of meaning, and we have to actually work with singularity. When we transform and when we invent the new city, we need to think about this. I think we should go back to a certain type of urban planning based on use, when actually public spaces are there, the public buildings have been designed, and actually the promoters, the developers have gone. The city dwellers are there, the inhabitants are there, but so we need to look at the uses. We need to be with the inhabitants, with the students, with the entrepreneurs. We need to be with them in that city that we need to transform. Of course, we need an urban planning that involves different functions, a mapping, a modeling, of course. But these are just approaches that we need to discuss, to adjust. So an urban planning based on uses that is close to people's daily lives, is that right? That was close to what Mr. Jean Goffner was saying. But that presupposes the fact that we need to be able to describe daily lives of people before we can think about prototypes that would help such and such a domain of activity before looking at a magical object. François, do you want to come back to what has been said? Not really at this stage. Maybe I will go back on this later if I have the opportunity later on. I have a question. I think, well, in a world where you have all these uncertainties and with the mad belief that all our resources are unlimited, this reassures, of course, economic stakeholders. So there are moments where we have certainties and economic reassurances, and there are moments when there are lots of uncertainties and complex questions. And this is really a challenge. We have to, politicians and have to answer micro questions about small neighborhoods. How do you articulate that dilemma, that challenge between this long-term perspectives and this very short-term decisions that you have to make? Well, with regards to the micro solutions you need to implement with regards to specific territories, as well as with regards to perspective and broader outlook, I really think that when you look at the current crisis we have today, I think what is really important is to, develop the cycling tracks, cycling paths. This is a way to act within this crisis, and it is both something you can do on the short term, which will also have an impact on the longer term. Private stakeholders may also want more from public stakeholders to kind of bypass this, and then you have civil society and associations on the other side. But I think the crisis and the emergencies that we are facing today have kind of upset all of this setup. And with regards to the cycling tracks, we didn't really continue with that process, and I think this is a type of action which is really important for the common interests and in which we can act together. François, do you want to have something to say on this? Well, with regards to this crisis, I think we're facing an innovation crisis. And this is a response, it is an alternative to innovations that are here to prepare the longer term. I think this tactical urban planning, just like the transitional urban planning, consists in introducing new uses or new features, new functions on a shorter time period based on the prospect of their evolution, but not with a prospect of imagining what will be the good services for tomorrow, for the future. So if we look at these steps, if we look at this contingency with the obligation because of the sustainable development obligations, then we're entering a world whereby the status of innovation changes completely. This participates in the crisis of the regimens for the future. Thank you, François. Charles, do you have something to say? This is a fundamental question about the articulation between the emergency and prospects, future prospects.
By that, I mean that, well, I hear that we're going to build bicycle lanes, you know, in emergency to accommodate the changes in traveling patterns. So Jean-Marc Koffner, whom we referenced earlier on, said recently, you know, bicycles can be a false good idea because the first, you know, figures that we have show us that even if we increase the number of bicycle lanes, it doesn't necessarily mean that there will be less cars, but there will be additional footprint taken from the pedestrian areas. So, and also, this could take footfall away from public transportation. So, but we need more time. We would need more time to conclude on this, definitely. But what I'm interested in is how people will make new public spaces their own, will hack it, so to speak. But, and how long will it take? What I was trying to understand when I talked about the transition from experimenting to planning to transitioning, we've forgotten about the longer term. And accepting, embracing uncertainty is accepting that things take time. It doesn't mean that planning or programming is obsolete, but I think we need to approach it differently. Maybe we need to start from the idea that urban planning document must be flexible and is something that will evolve in time. So I think we have to be aware and be, you know, skeptical of the short term. And it's interesting to live in the short term and to want solutions for now. But you also need to have your eyes on the horizon of the city, of the future city. And I agree with what Jean-Luc Charles was saying. A project doesn't stop or doesn't end when the first tenants or owners move into their new homes. It's actually the beginning of a new phase in the project. If I may talk about the connection between tactical urban planning and the longer term, I don't think it's incompatible. If we work with people and communities, we can do this. I mean, this is what I call strata or layer urban planning. For instance, why should we deliver projects with a final layout, if you will, something that will not move? Why not see how it goes for 2 or 3 years when it's lived in, and then 2 or 3 years after, if it's not conclusive, we work on a new hypothesis until a road or a square you know, is satisfying to the eyes of the inhabitants. So obviously this hits certain obstacles, technical, regulatory obstacles. So obviously when you deliver on a project, you then transfer it to somebody else's ownership. So these are rules that we will probably have to challenge if we want to, again, combine tactical urban planning and the longer term. We're not there yet, but I think we will get there. And I think this is one way for people to co-build, to co-design something. And everyone then can realize that building a square, building a public place, it's not something that happens overnight. You cannot decide that it will be a success. I mean, think of all the popular squares and public spaces in the south, in the Mediterranean areas. They've been centuries in the making. I like this idea of reverting course, of going backwards in urban planning. Maybe we could now turn to another side of the discussion. You were saying, Laurent, that a pandemic is at the door, and cities were really affected, obviously, so globally it was difficult to imagine how they could adapt. But what this question brought about, not necessarily just in academic circles, but also in local governments, the notion of resilience, which is sort of an old idea in a way. And what came to the fore, again, is that cities should work on their capacity for resilience. But it's not something that is easy to frame, if you will. We have with us Montserrat. Can you hear me, Montserrat? I guess you're hearing the translation. Montserrat is an economics professor at the University of Barcelona. She has worked a lot on creative cities and creation in cities. And I think that through the work that you've carried out, the work of observation, what can you tell us about cities in the time of pandemics? What changes for, transportation, mobility? But historically, cities are where changes happen first. This is a breeding ground for changes, for revolutions. And in Barcelona, you've observed a certain number of bottom-up approaches, community-led approaches. So we could first give you the floor so that you could give us your analysis of the resilient city through the examples in Barcelona.
Yes, of course. Right. You will see my presentation in a minute, which is here and here. Right. So first of all, thank you very much for this invitation. I have very nice memories from Nantes a while ago, also in a sort of innovation forum, talking about creative cities and creative industries. So as Raphaël said very well, I'm an economist. I come from Barcelona. And I think that it's worth to pay a little bit of attention of this concept of resilience, which is very much used when looking at the city and how the city has reacted to the impact that the pandemic represents. But also, I would like to stress during my presentation that it's not only something that we are right now living, experiencing, it's something that the city has been used to, which is external shocks that force the city to react and to adapt to the new situation. So I think that we would all agree that we are living in very complex scenarios, especially these days, that we were expecting the outbreak to come later, but it came sooner than expected. And this is creating lots of stress and lots of tension in between politicians, in between the different actors at the different levels, the city level, the national level, and the supranational level as well. As you know, the city is, by definition, a place where we need to be together, or we want to be together. So this density, which is inherent to the definition of a city, it's nowadays forbidden in different ways. So the city is nowadays combining this social distance, which is required for sanitary prescription, and the density, which is the soul of the city. Also, the city is a scenario for policies, and these policies can be the usual top-down policy, which is the municipal or the local government acting and according to whatever the goal. But also, we know that we have witnessed since March interesting bottom-up approaches, which are non-organized or self-organized procedures that provide the city of a meaning for many people, for many people that belong to the community. We would also agree that we enjoy a diversity of tools in terms of react to this pandemic. And also, as I will say, and I will define later, we do have not only resources and not only tools, but different resources to act. So, as I was saying, the pandemic is something that is not the first time. We have seen many pandemics, and we were already told that there was, if not a pandemic, a virus, there was something that would come sooner, than expected as well, which was the climate change. We have seen this amazing traditional flu, Spanish flu, by the way, representation where people were already wearing masks, and they were, all of them, advised to stay at home, which we have heard for a long while. So in order to keep Chicago the healthiest city in the world, amazingly enough and contradictory enough, people should be at home without, as we have been also in the last months. So when we talk about resilience, resilience is mainly linked to shocks. Different types of shocks. I mean, before the COVID-19, we were very much aware of the resilience of the city, which all the negative impacts in front of, as I said, the climate change, the global warming. We were all witnessing different examples of how the city was reacting or was absorbing this external change. These are examples. Some of them are not true, as you might imagine, but some others are very much true. And we know that, okay, in front of the crisis, in front of the shock, the city is resilient, the city adapts. But what does resilience mean? The first thing that we need to say is that resilience comes from the pure science field. So it's a measure, I am quoting, a measure of the persistence of ecological systems and of their ability to absorb shocks and disturbance and still maintain the same relationships with the state variables. So this is definitely a laboratory definition, and we know that when we look at the city is not a laboratory, and when we belong to social sciences, we know that we cannot experiment with the city. The cities are dynamic. We know that they are the source of interactions. Cities is where the community, the urban community, do relate intentionally and unintentionally. This is also a scenario for very resilient actors, like maybe I can put an example. All the Fab Labs in many cities were extremely resilient to the pandemic. They immediately reacted, producing whatever they could for as gadgets for to wear during the lockdown. But we know that there are also some not very resilient actors, which, for instance, could be old people without internet connection. I would like to say that urban resilience is a process, is not a feature, it doesn't characterize the city. What is important is how the city goes from one place to the other. Right? I don't know. Yeah. So what makes a city resilient? And I think I'm not inventing this. I'm relying on academic sources. So they are the elements that make the city resilient are the resources that could be natural resources, but also created resources. So whatever facility or equipment has been installed and created in the city, the people itself, the environment, which might not only be related to the built environment, but also to the culture, to the atmosphere, to the habits, to the tradition, to all these kind of elements, the availability of technology and the quality of technology, and of course the creation of knowledge. I think that because I was hearing some of the comments before, you were talking about innovation in the city, and I think that we are now very much proud of this car sharing movement because before the pandemics we thought that in order to diminish the overlap of people going one car, it would be very interesting to share the car, and this car sharing movement was very popular. But that was already thought after or during the Second World War, when they were saying if you are riding an empty seat, it's as if Hitler was sitting next to you. So we have been innovative when probably this resilience is needed in front of a shock. In that case, it was Hitler. But there is also some proof of resilience, like, for instance, the working at home. I mean, the telework or working at home or working online. And this is very interesting because there are many reports, the Bain report, for instance, published in 2016, which is before the pandemics, that they were saying, okay, the technology is getting cheaper. Why do we need to go every day to our office when we can work at home and we can just avoid the congestion, avoid commuting at the end of the day? We know that because of the pandemics, that was an example of resistance in some cases and of resilience in some others, because many people moved easily or not that easily from working at work to working at home. And as you might know, and I am sure that you know this, that there are changing residential preferences because of this. I mean, people fearing the future fearing a future lockdown, they are leaving the city, which that would need another presentation probably, which is what is the impact in terms of housing in the city when people decide to move out, and especially what is the impact in the inner city, because the inner city also by definition is the place where less green areas you can find or less space, open spaces. So I come from Barcelona. I think that that was mentioned before, and I think that it's interesting to have a look from a particular city, a special city, which is Barcelona. And I think that as an economist, and as John Maynard Keynes was saying, in the long term, everybody is dead. But I think that it's good to at least pay attention at how the crisis, so from March to May, I would say, was managed in the city, but especially how the future perspectives of the city look like in these days. So I think that the first thing that we have to say during the crisis, that would be the very short term, was the community engagement. We could see that people were looking for other people that they didn't know, but they wanted to share the experience of being locked down at home. And somehow that provided some tools for creating this community engagement that, I mean, if I were a sociologist, I would start saying that it was in many places in absolute decline, because we are moving to a more individualized society. So that was a good reaction to the pandemics. The other one were the examples, as I was mentioning before, of those fab labs and makers that reacted immediately. And I have to say that it was amazing. Even at the university, all the labs that are allocated in different faculties were producing things, and I'm sure that you have examples, very low cost, very adaptable, very needed. So in Barcelona, it was, I think, fabulous, the reaction of the Fab Labs producing for the whole community of the city. Also, these community centers that the city enjoys since the beginning of the democracy in 1975, these places where people go just to enjoy some spare time, leisure time, and share with others. So they became local facilities to distribute food. And that was definitely, they became more than a social leisure center, a social infrastructure center that probably will go beyond the pandemic, which is the capacity to be next to the population. This micro, you were saying before, micro agents that connect perfectly well the citizenship with the city. Also from the local government, it was not only a question of bottom-up, but also top-down. They were very much aware of the need to support especially small and medium companies. They were providing tools for quick digitalization, and that was very welcomed by some companies, that the only way was to move completely their business into the online field, the online sphere. And I would say that they managed, and they got even some recognition, they managed to protect the health of many workers in different areas of the municipality, which is one of the big companies of the city. So, okay. Now we know that Barcelona, like many other cities, reacted well to the pandemic. I mean, putting aside the fact that I am completely bored of this moving from Vienna to Nantes in one day without changing probably the seat where I am sitting. No? So what after the lockdown? And this is... I know that most of you have visited Barcelona, and this is definitely not a picture, a common picture of the city. Here you have La Ramblas, which is empty, and that was one day in the middle of the week at midday. So in let's say in December, that was probably, you couldn't see the pavement. Not only that, it's this closing down of many small businesses that were, some of them devoted to tourism, that this is clearly impossible to reconnect with the reality of the city, but also many other side effects, for instance, in the housing market. As I was saying, we know that because of the tourism and the increase of tourism, Airbnb was, even if under control, it was very, it was absorbing a huge part of the private rented market in the city, and nowadays it's going the other way around. Now there are more private rented apartments than ever before. So, of course, we need to look at things from a positive side, although, and maybe because it's Friday and I'm tired, but I have to say that these pictures that you just saw were taken by me 2 weeks ago, and I got shocked, honestly. I thought that, okay, we have to do it much better. We know that, but it's going to be hard. So the first thing in a positive way that I need to tell you is that the pandemic can be seen as an opportunity for the city to be rethought, to be replanned, and to be reanalyzed in a better way. And as you know, tourism was something that was already a challenge for the city. Now the challenge is the lack of tourism. So if we don't want more tourism in the city, because part of the wealth of the city comes from tourism, it's clear that we need to do it in a better way. Also, it was evident during the pandemic that the digital divide exists, and it creates not only a divide in the community, but also a divide in the businesses. We did some research on the digitalization of the small and medium companies in Barcelona, and amazingly enough, despite the huge amount of resources available, they were still some steps behind. So that was one of the things, and I'm quoting Vicente Guallar, which is an architect, well-known architect in Barcelona. He was the head of the urban planning department at the municipality. He said that the pandemic was accelerating the future. And I think that in the case of the digital transition, it's clear that the pandemic has provided some food for thought to the need of digitalization of the city. Also, in terms of mobility, I also heard that you were talking about mobility before, and yeah, well, the city was empty. The challenge of mobility has been there for a long while. It's not something that came the other day and, right, okay, now that the city is empty, let's go and let's create more pedestrian avenues. It has been done in a provisional way. And this is, you can see this pedestrian mobility. Some streets of the city were painted in yellow, highly criticized by many. And they were supposed to be spaces for, not for cars, but for other types of mobility, like bicycles or motorbikes or things like that, or pattings. I don't know how to say that in English, skaters. The thing is that the municipality decided that that was a provisional step. They would move into something more long-lasting, but they didn't want to lose the opportunity to exhibit this need of pedestrianization of the city, right? And this is an example. Also, some streets are closed during the weekend, which, for instance, if you are a taxi driver and you are moving around the city and you don't have tourists anymore and you cannot go straight from one place to the other, they, as you can imagine, were not very happy of this closing down of cities. Also, the festivity, the La Marse, which is well known as many French people come to La Marse because it's still summer. It's the 24th of September, and this year it was almost a complete online event. And the things that were not online were for a photo that was highly reduced. So I would like to summarize. I would like to provide some food for thought, and I think that we would all agree that we still have the same urban challenge. No, we all want environmentally respectful, healthier, inclusive, and equal cities. And this is something that is still there, was there before the pandemic, but as I said, the future might be accelerated. So if we want this challenge to be fulfilled, maybe we should look at the pandemic as the driver for a quicker action. So yes, an opportunity to rethink, but you would agree with me that this rethinking, at least we are still suffering. I mean, Madrid from 2 hours ago became again in complete lockdown. So we as a community, we as researchers, but also the different statements at the policy level, I think that there were some elements that appeared during the lockdown that are still or are there to be there, are there to stay. One of the first things were honoring the elderly, but from the perspective that honoring the values that the elderly had. No? That's one important thing, because we need to reimagine a new future for us, for the community, and for the city. And sometimes in the recent past, there were some values that were somehow lost. We understood the importance of the community, and I think that it was like revisiting this aspect that in this individualized society that we were living in was a bit lost. And again, you might remember the Lady Gaga concert. We were all watching that music festival. And I think that it was not because of the music, of course it was because of the music, but we felt somehow connected with other parts of the globe. But in terms of the city, I think that it's important to recognize what is nowadays a real challenge. Are we thinking to go back to business? Are we thinking to go, what it means? I mean, to go back to normal. Everybody talks about the new normal, but what is the new normal? It's that we are going to wear masks, okay, for a while, hopefully. But after, are we looking at the new scenario with old eyes, or we need to change our eyes? So I think that this idea of timing that I already mentioned at the beginning, so we know that there are immediate necessities. We know that there are companies going down, closing down. We heard that the Spanish ministry, the Spanish prime minister announced 800,000 new employment. But we know who is going to be able to adapt to these new jobs that are going to be created. And this is a question of short term. How are we going to deal with that? But then I think that sustainability, which is a value that we all know, was important. We had our sustainable development goals, but maybe we need to revisit them, and we need to look at things like the city from a more enduring perspective. I think that this is also interesting, very much related to the idea of honoring our peers, and that comes from a Japanese colleague that was paying attention to how houses were built in the past and how that was completely forgotten in this quick, dynamic, buzzing city. So maybe the new future needs some elements that have to be built looking back at how the city was built. I think that technology, I already mentioned that technology is important because it helps to be resilient. But not everybody has the same access to technology. I think that one important thing is to be able to scale whatever is working in the city, so from prototyping to scaling. The digital rights are something that have to deal with that with respect to the digitalization of society, and also the impact of this post-COVID law. I mean, how are we going to deal with intellectual property, digital rights, and so on and so forth in this new society that we are aiming to? But again, and I'm quoting Cecilia Tam, which is an architect, thinker, and many other things. She said, well, hands-on, no? Done is better than perfect. Again, as an economist, the usual rhetoric would be, okay, let's look at the market, how the market, the efficiency of the market. No, we rely on the efficiency of the market. It's the best assignment model to reallocate the resources in the best way. But maybe super efficiency is not very resilient. Super efficiency is promoting or provoking some social risk. And we are nowadays witnessing how this super efficiency is providing some very difficult situations for some collectives of the population. Super efficiency means leaving everything to the market. I think that this is not exactly, I'm not talking about the policy intervention, not only. I think that even within the company, there are some other values that are surrounding this super efficiency that any organization has as a usual challenge. No? So this is also why I think that that goes farther from the city, but I think that rethinking management in organization is interesting because values have to play a bigger role than they used to play in the past. So the Sustainable Development Goals, the old challenges of the Sustainable Development Goals of 2020 now have to be revisited in the 2030 one. So just to finish, some elements that I think that come as something interesting. The first is that we were able to react. And probably if 1 year ago somebody told the population that they were going to be in a lockdown for more than 2 months and a half, everybody would have said, well, you are joking. No? So radical measures in emergency periods worked. And this is interesting from a community point of view. The idea of the democratization of the new demands, especially looking at this idea of the digitalization and also green spaces, for instance, which is also a new demand from the citizenship. The combination in between policy and so top-down and bottom-up initiatives doesn't mean that strategic direction is not needed. And I think that as a city, and as a person that is very interested in urban planning, a strategic direction is more important than ever. And I would like to clarify, I am a clear supporter of whatever the strategic planning means for a city. I think that the pandemic provided an element which helped to break the borders, the boundaries of the political city. I think that the metropolitan city and the new dimension of the city it's gaining force. And I think that this is also related to the fact that when looking for solutions, we cannot look at them alone. Moving in further, moving fast forward, the need of cooperation and coordination between levels of government, that's something that it's on the wishful list forever. The importance of innovation ecosystems and the community well-being in this new society, in this new post-COVID urban atmosphere. Who is taking the lead now? I will go back into that. I think that we know that the community is providing lots of solutions, but I wouldn't say that the community has to lead the recovery. I think that the recovery agenda needs a straightforward direction, and that can only come from the policymaking sphere. But again, we know that there are new patterns of co-production of the city. There are some issues like the 15-minute city that you have closer than I, that has been put into practice. Also, the ideas that were already getting more and more popular, which is like, for instance, the circular economy or the creative and cultural sectors. But I think that all in all, we need to learn from mistakes, and we need to look back and see what didn't work when recovering or when facing this, what the pandemic is representing for the cities, and trying to do it best. So I will finish here. Thank you very much, and I will stop sharing my screen. And I don't know if how this will work, if we will have some...
Déjà, merci Montserrat.
Thank you, Montserrat, for these food for thoughts. What I take from it is that I don't know if creative cities are resilient, but resilient cities will require creativity. At the local level, it will require technology, new dynamic. So you're opening avenues. It's not always an answer to complex issues, but avenues to explore. So I will leave the floor to Hélène and Emmanuel. You're in charge of sensing work of initiatives that are widely spread out. There were many initiatives taken. There were a lot of good ideas. No one has the monopoly of the good idea or the best solution. But could you define some rules coming out of your observations? What did you think of all that happened? Well, first of all, thank you, Raphaël. Thank you, Montse, because I think part of our observations will actually find an echo in what you just presented us with. So I find it reassuring, actually. First observation to share with you. It was mentioned throughout this roundtable. The fabric of cities was highly questioned by the health crisis. Many topics arose, a lot of hope came out, changes were fueled, a lot of controversy as well, and maybe some elucubration, some delusions, if you will. Is it the end of the city? Because in urban city, you hear also contagion. So is it the end of public transports, for instance? Will they disappear, and will bicycles replace buses? So the health crisis, its impacts, a lot of initiatives and research that were initiated. In terms of urban research, especially because that's what we're looking at, where there were surveys, reviews, call for projects, it was not coordinated. So it was a bit hard to find our way within all this. So our second observation is that it will take time to reflect on all this and to observe all this and analyze it. Yes, it is a necessity to take time to look at all this. And PUCA actually took that into account, so we started a watch work and an analysis work to really see what this crisis reveals in the urban fabric. So it was a paired work with the teams of the PUCA. Our methodology. We're working on a corpus, on an overall watch, the press, the daily press, the territories around France, but not only, and something more academic. So some reviews, journals, and so on. A lot of initiatives were taken. So we brought together information from a different set of watches from various research entities like the MSH in Paris or the Urban School of Lyon. So within this cultural project, we came up with deliverables and outputs. We wanted to have a press review, and it led to the implementation of a portal on the internet on publications and articles around 8 topics that we thought were key: mobility, public spaces, housing, environment, health and biodiversity, urban planning, construction, and local economies, circular economy, and employment. So to work along with all this weekly press analysis, we had a monthly memo, if you will, so to have a retrospective vision on the crisis. And we already had the one on biodiversity, and the next one will be on housing. So we listed the activities of research that were ongoing, especially focusing on urban research. That period was really fruitful in terms of experimentation in the urban fabric. And it was true for each period within the crisis, whether in the crisis management during lockdown and the various systems and plannings that were thought for the longer term. So we have several categories of innovation. So as was said before, there were urban methodology, working with the inhabitants. So learning more about the needs to adapt housing better, adapt transport better, to co-construct the city with the inhabitants. And that's what Nantes has chosen to do. Barcelona as well, Grenoble. Of course, that existed before the crisis, but these methods were actually strengthened by the crisis. In Nantes, the Corona cycling path. This is what the citizens have called them, and we'll see in the long run if they work as well as during the heart of the crisis. Secondly, the responsiveness made it more and more flexible. There was room left for uncertainty. So some spaces were already dedicated to some usages, but the crisis made it compulsory to really give some leeway, if you will, in this use of public spaces. And as was already said before, we can say that the most optimized a city is, the less resilient it is. So maybe it needs to have some hidden resources that it can rely on at all times. We can see that in Nantes, that alternative places can actually change. The Magellan workshop was an artistic workshop that became the other canteen, that is to say, a place for food baskets distributions for underprivileged populations. The third aspect we can highlight is the capacity for rebound of local economies, especially at the municipal level, with municipal councils making decisions more rapidly, as we mentioned, solidarity gardens, food gardens, using green spaces to grow food, to have access to fresh products in the city for the underprivileged populations especially. So there was cross-cutting work between the green spaces, the social workers, and so on. So there is this capacity of rebounds from the citizens and the city, with a set of examples of initiatives in a very DIY mindset. Maybe they were compensating a failing government, but they managed to find ways to create respiratory machines and so on. And there was the extent of projects carried out by citizens to work with the elderly, to bring food baskets to isolated people, and also to develop short food supply chains. Another strong innovation, or actually experimentation, if I use the distinction between the two that was used at the beginning of this roundtable, during the crisis, there was a strong need to shift the paradigm of urban development, integrating diversity, biodiversity, preserving ecosystems in the city, and more broadly than that, the health crisis was an opportunity to really reposition mankind within an ecosystem instead of above it all. We call sorry, I'm using a very French expression that is very controversial that the government used about fundamentalist Muslim people, but I'm using it actually in another meaning. It's about biodiversity and the fact to leave room for wildlife and getting rid of more getting rid of concrete built tarmac areas to leave room for biodiversity. And a lot of projects have been developed in that regard. And there is research developing as well in that regard. The PUCA has released a call for project. And the point is to give incentive to researchers to look into biodiversity, urban planning, and morphology of the city, and these are things that are going to be looked at further by researchers. And another aspect that was key to us is the need to think about reversibility of actions and decisions of office, facilities, and constructions of the municipality. This health crisis was an invitation for researchers, thinkers, and professionals of urban development to rethink things. There were empty spaces that were used for emergency housing during the crisis. A tennis facility in New York was used for emergency housing. Emergency and services were developed. For instance, high-speed trains were equipped over a day to become moving hospitals to transfer patients from one hospital to the next. And so the acceleration of some subjects that had already been identified by the Urbain stakeholders to actually face the environmental crisis. Some subjects were already highlighted before: productive city, integrating environmental health in urban development plannings. It's interesting, but it was actually seen with a fresh eye, if you will. Things that we had not anticipated before the crisis, for instance, maybe Airbnb may be decaying in some city centers, and it might stop gentrification, for instance. So things that were absolutely not expected. A lot of changes were not expected before the crisis. So will these experiments observed become long-term? So will they become innovations that become enshrined in the city? Another aspect that we thought was interesting was the need to develop long-term research and to not only be analyzing immediate facts. So, because we will need that to really draw conclusions and learn lessons on city co-construction. And last comment, that actually is linked to my own research project, the position of culture in the post-COVID crisis, because right now urban stakeholders have not looked at that deeply, because creativity and the artistic sector have a role to play in innovations. We all know that, but it would be interesting to look at a post-COVID city. What does the future hold in a city where all shows, events, and everything is done outdoors? How can we associate artists to the new urban fabric? So what skills will be associated, will be brought around the table? I took the example of artists, but it was also true for epidemiologists, ecologists, that will have to be integrated more and more in the urban field. These are some of my observations.
Mise en perspective. Peut-être pour le quart d'heure qui nous reste, j'aimerais mettre un peu...
Thank you for putting this into perspective. And in the 15 minutes we have left, I'd like to talk about the function, the public function or peri-public function. And I'd like to ask how the COVID crisis had an impact on your development prospects, how it maybe modified the trajectory of the projects for the Isle of Nantes. And what is resilience? What does resilience mean? When you're a president of Nantes Metropole, I don't have any answers to that, but how do you apprehend this mandate and this mission? Maybe Jean-Charles to start? I'm going to talk about an exploratory approach conducted by Samoa with different stakeholders, and we installed a sort of lab which was animated by the Auxilia group, and the rules of the game were to determine the tangible facts of the health crisis that could influence the city of the future and how us urban planners could absorb that shock and adapt to it. So we gathered, we met 3 times, and during the first meeting we identified the accelerators in the COVID crisis, and then we worked on imaginary and prospective scenarios. How we could design the Isle of Nantes, how we could conceive and design the urban planning in the Isle of Nantes. We used a matrix with the Sustainable Manifesto, the Resilient Island, the Complicit Island, the Island of the Commons, the Island of Health and Well-being. This is the matrix the project relied on for the past 2 years or something like that, 2 or 3 years. I'm going to go quite fast on this, but if we want to talk about the accelerators that were identified by the collective on Resilient City, do we need to reduce or increase the density? Is it is it a city with only short distances, short travel distances, or more of an urban spread? What type of city do we want? So density is another factor which is actually favorable, which kind of favors the development of the virus. So if you gather too many people in closed spaces, it could accelerate the propagation of the virus. But I don't want to dwell too much on this. Second point about the architecture, the fact that the architecture needs to adapt itself, and the fact that we need to develop a different type of planning Each building is on a particular land slot and could be destroyed or made bigger. It goes back to what we said about biodiversity. The perception of local economy is strengthened by this because short circuits, local economy, circular economy becomes more efficient, and I think that's a decisive approach. And then the remote working, the fact that remote work is more adopted is the fact that more and more people resort to remote working is interesting as well, and it results in decreased transport. So we want to, what we really identified are the virtues of the fact of relying on your local neighborhoods, your local scale. The different stakeholders got mobilized on this, and we really saw how important it was to rely on your local community. There was a relationship with time, which was interesting. I think lockdown taught us to live more slowly, at a slower pace, and I think you need to combine both paces between the fact of having like a vibrant city and also a city that is also works at a slower pace, and with places where you can meditate and you can be sitting quietly. And there was also a recognition as to the viability of proximity services and goods. Just a few words, because unfortunately time is nearly up. I just want to finish on an idea which is very important. When you look at the scenarios at the end of the approach, at the end of the step, we can see that there are two wishes that are kind of complementary. So there's a need for security and a need for adventure. So there's the need for a vibrant city and also this need for more like a type of village, a city which is more secure, brings more security. So there are two dimensions here, a city with a metropolitan dimension, with this adventure aspect, and a city which is like an archipelago or an island or a village, and which is more secure, gives more security. How do you steer public action with regards to these different challenges and the dynamic which is ongoing? And resilience, what does resilience mean in your mandate? We knew we were going towards a very unprecedented mandate. We need to change the way we do things and the way we've worked before. And with this crisis, it shows that we've never been able to act so quickly. There was something to do very quickly, and we were able to act with this emergency. And then with regards to this crisis, I think this crisis was also a way of seeing the city in a different way, a city without traffic, a city without planes, also a city without social life, without socializing, which also led us to think about this. What do we want, and what is normalcy? Will we ever come back to normal? The city had to look after food security. We had to check that everyone could have enough food. And unfortunately, with the modern cities consume more energy than they produce, and they don't produce enough food for the number of people that that dwell in the cities. So there are lots of things that need to be changed, and I think there are also challenges, very strong challenges in the years to come, and there are things that will be increasing in the years to come. Challenges and ideas about, for example, putting more trees, more vegetation in cities, removing the bitumen. So having less roads and more trees. So looking more at the structures. In the Netherlands, the cycling lanes were actually implemented after the oil shock. And I think it's actually very relevant. We need to actually look at the public space and make it our own again, look at all the different neighborhoods, look at the different concepts, also the fact of socializing, you know, the fact of creating bonds between people, that's very important. What is the city? What does it mean? We need to think about all these questions. And we need to think about this in order to think about how we plan urban areas. Do you think it would be interesting to discuss with other European cities about their weaknesses, their strengths? Do you think there are things that you can identify, which you could get some inspiration for your territory? Within the EU, we are discussing with cities that are facing the same challenges. We always got inspiration from what was done elsewhere, but the conditions are not necessarily the same. The soil is not necessarily the same, but this type of innovation, when you talk about technical innovation and, of course, extending the concept of innovation, the fact of talking about social innovation, for instance, is absolutely essential to understand the crisis and how we can get out of the crisis. And there are also different types of lobbies. We saw this in the Covenant of Mayors, which saw it with the adaptation of cities to climate change, and it enables us to be stronger, to get the means necessary to implement solutions for our towns and cities. I think we have about 35 seconds left. This is the end of a very passionate and very interesting debate. And it's very interesting to confront both an academic thought and more of a practical train of thoughts and pragmatic thinking. Do you have something to say as a last word? I think this is not a conclusion, but I was thinking about this challenge, this issue about the structural and what is just what depends on the circumstances. And at the level of the state, what is maybe instructive and quite amusing, it's a good example for researchers, but it should not be a monopoly for the question of perspective at the national level, and it's the issue of associations and perspective. And François is here, and I think it is time for us to say goodbye. Thank you very much for your participation in this discussion. que je te